Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. For years, Americans were told that the biggest threat to the country was inequality, that the government needed to spend more, regulate more, expand more programs, and build a bigger safety net to protect vulnerable people. And for a long time, a lot of Americans accepted that argument. Medicaid expanded, welfare programs grew, federal spending exploded. Politicians promised that with enough money and enough compassion, government could solve almost every social problem. But now a different question is starting to spread across America. What if the system itself is no longer under control? Not because helping poor people is wrong, not because social programs are automatically bad, but because the size, complexity, and lack of accountability inside the modern American welfare system may have created something nobody fully understands anymore. And recently, an investigation out of Ohio touched a nerve because it seemed to confirm one of the biggest fears many Americans already had: that massive amounts of taxpayer money are flowing through systems so bloated and poorly monitored that nobody really knows where the money is going. The story focused on Medicaid home health care programs in Ohio, particularly in immigrant communities around Columbus. And on the surface, this sounded like a normal investigation into fraud and abuse. But the deeper you look, the more this story becomes about something much bigger than one city, one state, or even one welfare program. It's about whether the American government is still capable of managing the giant system it has built. Because the numbers involved here are staggering. According to the investigation, Ohio spent around $1 billion in a single year on home health care services. Now, in theory, some of this makes perfect sense. America has an aging population. Many elderly people prefer staying at home instead of entering nursing facilities. Paying family members or caregivers to help them can sometimes be cheaper and more humane than institutional care. That's the official logic. And honestly, there's truth in that. The problem is that once huge amounts of government money start flowing into loosely monitored systems, incentives change fast. Very fast. Especially when the services being billed happen inside private homes where verification becomes difficult. That's where this story gets interesting. The investigation described entire office buildings filled with home healthcare companies, many of them small operations with little visible activity. Some reportedly had no real online presence. Some appeared to share addresses. Some owners allegedly had histories of tax problems, financial disputes, or failed businesses in unrelated industries before suddenly becoming successful in the Medicaid home care world. Now, to be clear, not every company involved is automatically corrupt. That's important to say. But when you start hearing stories about dozens of healthcare companies operating out of nearly empty buildings while billing massive amounts to taxpayers, people naturally begin asking questions. And those questions get even bigger when the services themselves are difficult to verify. Because unlike traditional hospitals or clinics, home care services happen behind closed doors. A caregiver may be billing the government for helping a family member cook meals, clean the house, provide companionship, or assist with daily activities. Sometimes those services are legitimate, sometimes they may not be. And unless investigators physically monitor homes constantly, proving fraud becomes extremely difficult. That creates what economists call a moral hazard. But honestly, regular Americans don't need academic language to understand what's happening here. They instinctively understand something simpler. If a system spends enormous amounts of money with weak oversight, abuse will eventually grow. And once abuse grows, public trust starts collapsing. That's exactly what's happening across America right now. Because this story taps into a much larger feeling spreading through the country, the feeling that the federal government keeps spending more money while ordinary Americans increasingly doubt whether anyone is actually in control. And that distrust didn't appear out of nowhere. For decades, America expanded programs faster than it expanded accountability. Every political crisis created demands for new spending. Every social problem generated another bureaucracy, another agency, another layer of administration. Over time, the federal government became enormous, complicated, fragmented, and incredibly difficult to monitor effectively. Meanwhile, technology changed faster than oversight systems could adapt. And now you have programs involving billions of dollars where state governments, federal agencies, private contractors, insurance administrators, healthcare providers, and thousands of small companies all interact inside systems so complicated that even experts struggle to track what's happening. That complexity creates opportunities. Some people exploit loopholes. Some exaggerate services. Some manipulate billing. Some operate in gray areas where proving wrongdoing becomes nearly impossible. And eventually, taxpayers start feeling like the entire machine has become a black box. That's really the emotional core of this story. Not simply fraud itself, but the sense that government spending has grown beyond the government's actual ability to supervise it responsibly. And politically, this issue becomes explosive because it intersects with another major American debate: immigration. The Ohio investigation focused heavily on Somali immigrant communities involved in the home care industry. That instantly transforms a financial oversight story into a cultural and political battlefield. Because once immigration enters the conversation, Americans stop hearing the same facts in the same way. Some people immediately see evidence that mass migration, combined with welfare expansion, creates unsustainable systems vulnerable to exploitation. Others see selective reporting designed to scapegoat immigrant communities while ignoring broader systemic problems that involve people from every background. And honestly, both sides contain partial truths. Yes, there absolutely have been documented cases of welfare fraud involving immigrant networks in certain areas. That's real. Federal investigators have pursued such cases before. Ignoring that reality out of political correctness helps nobody. At the same time, it's also true that America's welfare system problems are far bigger than any one immigrant group. Fraud, waste, abuse, and bureaucratic inefficiency exist across countless sectors involving people of every race, region, and political identity. The deeper issue is structural. The modern American administrative state has become so large and so financially massive that accountability itself struggles to keep up. That's the part I think many people are finally starting to notice. And this issue goes far beyond Ohio. Look at federal spending over the last 20 years. The numbers are almost hard to comprehend. Trillions for healthcare, trillions for entitlement programs, trillions for pandemic relief, trillions added to the national debt. And despite all that spending, many Americans feel daily life is becoming less affordable, less stable, and less functional. Healthcare costs remain high. Housing costs exploded. Public trust collapsed. Infrastructure age. Schools struggle. Cities face disorder. So naturally, people start asking, where is all the money going? That question is becoming one of the defining political questions of modern America. Because there's a growing disconnect between the scale of government spending and the public's confidence in government competence. And once confidence disappears, political anger rises fast. You can see this especially among working and middle-class Americans who feel squeezed from every direction. They pay taxes, they follow rules. They struggle with inflation, healthcare bills, and housing costs. Then they hear stories about companies billing taxpayers millions through programs they barely understand. That creates resentment, not necessarily against helping vulnerable people, but against the feeling that the system rewards manipulation more effectively than honest work. And once that feeling spreads, politics changes dramatically. This is part of why populist movements have exploded across the Western world. People increasingly believe large institutions no longer serve ordinary citizens effectively. Governments look inefficient, corporations look self-interested, universities look ideological, media organizations look disconnected from normal life. Bureaucracies look bloated, trust erodes everywhere. That erosion of trust is incredibly dangerous for a democratic society, because modern governments ultimately depend on legitimacy. People tolerate taxes when they believe the system broadly functions. People accept social programs when they believe the programs are reasonably fair and effective. But when citizens start viewing public institutions as wasteful, corrupt, or incompetent, the social contract weakens. And America may be entering that phase now. One reason this issue resonates so strongly is because Medicaid itself has become politically untouchable in many ways. Millions of Americans genuinely depend on it. Elderly people need care. Disabled individuals need assistance. Low-income families rely on healthcare support. Nobody wants vulnerable people abandoned. But at the same time, the size of these systems creates enormous opportunities for waste and abuse. That tension has become almost impossible to resolve politically, because every attempt to tighten oversight gets attacked from multiple directions. Some activists fear stricter enforcement could unfairly target minority communities or vulnerable populations. Some politicians fear backlash from cutting programs people rely on. Some bureaucracies resist reforms that threaten funding streams or institutional power. And meanwhile, the system keeps expanding. That's the cycle many Americans increasingly find alarming, especially conservatives. Because for decades, American conservatives have warned that large bureaucratic welfare systems eventually become inefficient, corrupt, and financially unsustainable. Stories like the Ohio investigation reinforce those fears dramatically. Now, whether conservatives are fully correct is another debate. But politically, these stories are powerful because they connect to broader anxieties Americans already feel. Anxiety about debt, about national decline, about institutional incompetence, about whether the government still works. And honestly, America's debt situation makes these concerns even more intense. The federal government now carries enormous long-term obligations through Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and other entitlement programs. As the population ages, those costs will rise further. Even without fraud, the numbers are becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. That's the deeper issue hiding underneath stories like this. Not just fraud, not just immigration, but whether the modern American fiscal model itself is becoming unstable. And that's a much bigger conversation than most politicians want to have honestly. Because both parties contributed to the current situation, Republicans often criticize spending while still supporting expensive policies of their own. Democrats often expand programs while downplaying long-term fiscal risks. Meanwhile, the national debt keeps climbing, regardless of who holds power. And ordinary Americans increasingly feel trapped inside a system where nobody seems capable of controlling costs anymore. Now, there's another important point here that often gets ignored. Most people receiving assistance are not criminals. Most caregivers are not fraudsters. Most immigrant families are not masterminding giant conspiracies. That distinction matters. One danger in political media today is that complex systemic failures get simplified into emotionally satisfying narratives about villains. But reality is usually messier. Many families genuinely need help caring for elderly relatives. Many caregivers work difficult jobs for modest pay. Many immigrants came to America legally and contribute productively to society. The problem is not that every individual inside the system is corrupt. The problem is that giant systems with weak oversight naturally attract abuse over time. That's true in healthcare. It's true in defense contracting. It's true in banking. It's true almost everywhere. Large amounts of money flow through bureaucratic structures, and the larger the system becomes, the harder accountability becomes. That's really the lesson Americans should focus on. Because if this debate turns purely into racial or anti-immigrant outrage, the country misses the larger issue entirely. The larger issue is institutional capacity. Can the American government still effectively manage enormous national systems in the 21st century? Can it track spending accurately? Can it detect fraud efficiently? Can it modernize oversight technology? Can it maintain public trust? Those questions matter far beyond Medicaid. They apply to nearly every major institution in the country right now. And I think one reason stories like this resonate so strongly online is because Americans increasingly sense that something fundamental has changed. For decades, the federal government kept growing under the assumption that expansion itself meant progress. Bigger budgets, bigger agencies, bigger programs, more management, more regulation, more complexity. But eventually, every system reaches a point where scale itself creates dysfunction. That may be where America is heading now. Not collapse, not apocalypse, but a slow crisis of confidence. A feeling that the system grows more expensive while becoming less competent. And historically, once societies begin losing trust in institutional competence, political instability usually follows. People become more cynical, more angry, more populist, more attracted to outsiders promising to clean up the system. That's not unique to America. It happens throughout history. When ordinary citizens believe elites built structures they can no longer control, political backlash becomes inevitable. And honestly, that backlash is already happening. You can see it in distrust of Washington, distrust of media, distrust of experts. Distrust of corporate power, distrust of federal agencies, distrust of nearly everything. The Ohio story didn't create that distrust. It simply plugged into it, because at the end of the day, the emotional reaction many Americans have to stories like this is actually very simple. They want to believe their country is being managed responsibly. They want to believe taxpayer money is treated carefully. They want to believe programs designed to help vulnerable people are not quietly turning into giant bureaucratic machines vulnerable to manipulation. And increasingly, many Americans are no longer confident that's true. That may be the real story here. Not just welfare fraud, not just immigration, but a growing fear that the American state itself has become too large, too complicated, and too disconnected from accountability to maintain public trust much longer. Thanks for watching.